The man in the worn riding leathers was crouched next to a half-built motorcycle, talking quietly with one of the welders about a seam in the fuel tank, when the CEO of the company walked onto the shop floor and decided to make an example of him. He did not ask who the man was. He did not need to. He could see what he was: scuffed boots, a beat-up jacket, 3 days of stubble, the look of a man who had ridden in off the street. And Preston Crane, who had a board meeting in 50 minutes that would decide whether his family's 90-year-old company survived, did not have the patience that morning for a stranger touching his merchandise. "Hey, hey," his voice cut across the shop. "Who let you in here?" The man started to stand. This is a working floor, not a museum. You can't just wander in off the street in a costume and start pawing at the product." Preston's voice was rising now, and he liked the way the floor went quiet around it. The way it always did. "Tess, why is this guy on my floor? Did you let him back here?" He turned back to the stranger. "I don't know what you think this is, but we build $40,000 machines here, and I'm not running a charity for guys who like the smell of the place. There's the door. Use it before I have someone walk you to it." The man in the leathers looked at him for a moment. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. "You're right," he said. "I should have checked in up front. My mistake." He turned to the welder. "Thank you, Tess. That weld's the best work I've seen on a tank in years. Don't let anybody tell you different." And he walked out. 50 minutes later, Preston Crane walked into his own boardroom to pitch the lead investor, whose money was the only thing standing between his company and the end. The investor was already seated at the head of the table, having arrived early, the way thoughtful people do. It was the man from the shop floor. It was Keanu Reeves. And the only question in Preston Crane's mind, as the blood left his face, was the one this whole story turns on. When you have just humiliated a man like that to his face in front of your own staff, who exactly do you call? There is a motorcycle company on a side street in the industrial flats of Vernon, just south of downtown Los Angeles, called Crane Motorworks, and it has been building machines by hand since 1937. Linus Crane started it with 2 employees and a welding torch in the back of a bicycle shop, and he built it on a single stubborn idea: that a motorcycle should be made the way a good watch is made, one at a time, by people who put their names on the work. For decades, that idea made Crane Motorworks something close to sacred among people who knew machines. The bikes were slow to build and expensive to buy and worth every dollar. Linus's signature was stamped into the headstock of every frame that left the floor. When he died, his son Edward kept the stamp. The shop floor still looked like 1937 in the ways that mattered. The same north-facing windows, grimed gold with 90 years of light. The smell of cutting oil and hot steel, and the particular ozone tang of a TIG arc. Hand tools worn smooth by 3 generations of palms. A wall of headstock stamps going back to the founding, each one a frame, each frame a person's afternoon. There were people on that floor whose fathers had worked on that floor. It was not a factory. It was a workshop that happened to be a business, and the difference was the entire point. But the business part had been losing for a long time. The market had changed. The debts had grown, $11 million of them, give or take, most of it inherited, some of it Preston's. The bank had stopped returning calls warmly. And the only lifeline left was a small group of private investors who cared about heritage manufacturing, led by a man who had quietly built a reputation for putting his own money behind craftsmen the world had stopped paying attention to. That man had asked to visit before he committed. He wanted to see the floor. He wanted to see how the bikes were actually made, and by whom. He had not asked for a tour. He had not announced himself. He had ridden in early on his own motorcycle, parked it on the street, walked onto the floor in his riding gear, and gone straight to the most interesting thing in the room, a half-built machine and the woman building it, which is how the lead investor in the rescue of Crane Motorworks came to be standing on its shop floor, being threatened with security by its CEO, who did not know what the man he was rescuing looked like because he had never thought to find out. Preston Crane was 44 years old, and he had spent every one of the last 11 years trying to prove a dead man wrong. His grandfather Linus had built the company. His father Edward had run it for 30 years, and Edward Crane had been a titan, brilliant, exacting, and cruel in a way that he called standards. Edward had raised Preston the way he ran the floor. Nothing was ever good enough. Every mistake was a referendum on the boy's character, and praise was a thing you withheld so it could not make a person soft. Preston had grown up on the receiving end of his father's contempt at the dinner table, and, worse, in front of the men on the floor, who had learned to look away when Edward started in on his son. "You'll run this place into the ground," Edward told him, more than once. "You don't have it. You never did." Then Edward died and left Preston the company anyway, because there was no one else, and Preston had spent 11 years drowning in the prophecy. The company was failing, not because Preston was lazy, he worked himself sick, but because the world had moved, and the debts were old, and some things cannot be saved by one frightened man working harder. And every quarter the numbers got worse. Preston heard his father's voice more clearly. "You don't have it. You never did." So he had become his father. Not on purpose. It just leaked out of him, under pressure, the only model of strength he had ever been shown. He dressed people down on the floor. He made examples. He confused fear for respect, because fear was the only thing his father had ever taught him to produce. He told himself it was leadership. It was a terrified man doing the one impression he knew. That morning, with the most important meeting of his life 50 minutes out, with the prophecy closer than it had ever been, Preston Crane walked onto his floor and saw a scruffy stranger touching his bikes, and every ounce of the fear in him came out as his father's voice. He did not see Keanu Reeves. He saw a chance to look, for once, like a man in control of something. He was wrong about that too. The welder's name was Tess Okafor, and she was 28, and she was the best builder on the floor by a distance everyone but Preston seemed to acknowledge. She had come up under old Goose Avila, the floor foreman, who had been at Crane for 40 years, and was the closest thing the place had to a soul. Tess could lay a weld bead so clean it looked machined, and she loved the work the way you love a thing you are good at, and she had been, quietly, about 3 weeks from quitting, because Preston's cost-cutting had begun chewing into the craft itself, and a shop that stops caring about the work is not a shop she wanted to give her hands to. When the man in the leathers had crouched down beside her that morning, he had not talked at her. He had asked her a real question about the scene she was running, the kind of question only someone who understood the work would ask, and they had been deep in it, two people who cared about the same thing, when Preston came across the floor. She had tried. "Mr. Crane, he's not just." She had started Tess back to work. He had not even looked at her. He had decided the man's worth in 4 seconds, and she had watched the whole floor absorb the lesson, that this was a place where a person could be erased in front of everyone, and that no one, not even the best builder in the room, got to say otherwise. She had gone back to her bench with her face hot, listening to a man she respected get walked toward the door, and she had thought, 3 weeks. I'm done in 3 weeks. She did not yet know that the stranger she had been talking to held the future of the entire company in his hands, or that the worst morning of Preston Crane's life was about to become the best thing that ever happened to her bench. In the boardroom, Preston Crane stood in the doorway and understood, all at once, the size of what he had done. He did not sit down. He could not. He said something. "Give me one moment, I'm so sorry. One moment." And he backed out of the room and into the hallway and pulled out his phone. Because that is what a man like Preston does in a crisis. He makes calls. He had spent his whole career believing that any problem could be managed, leveraged, spun, or paid down if you just got the right person on the line. So he called his head of investor relations, Dana. "He's here. He's in the room." And he could barely say it. "I threw him off the floor this morning. I didn't know who he was. I told him to get out. I threatened him with security." A long silence on the line. Then Dana, carefully, "You threatened the lead investor with security." "Preston, what exactly did you say to him?" he told her. Hearing it in his own voice was worse than living it. "I can't fix that with a phone call," Dana said. "Nobody can. That's not a PR problem. That's just a thing that happened." He hung up and called the board chair, his late father's old partner, a man named Arthur Voss, who had known Linus Crane personally. Arthur listened to the whole thing in silence, and when he spoke his voice was tired in a way Preston had never heard. "You know what your father would have done in there," Arthur said. "He'd have doubled down. He'd rather have lost the company than admit he was wrong in front of the floor. I watched him do it for 30 years. A pause. "I keep hoping you're not him. Don't make me stop hoping today." He called his assistant. He called the lawyer. He stood in that hallway with the phone hot against his ear, working down the list of everyone he had ever called to make a problem go away. And one by one they told him the same thing in different words. There was no one to call. The last call was to Gus Avila, the old foreman, down on the floor. Preston did not even know why he dialed it, except that Gus had been there since before Preston was born and had watched him grow up under Edward's contempt. Gus did not let him finish. "Son," Gus said, "I've been on this floor 40 years. I've seen every trick your daddy ever pulled to wriggle out of being wrong, and not one of them ever once made a man respect him. A breath. There's nobody on that phone who can save you. You want to fix this. You put the phone in your pocket, you walk back in that room, and for 10 minutes you be a better man than you were this morning. That's the only call left. And you gotta make it in person." Preston Crane put the phone in his pocket. He walked back into the room. Keanu had not moved. He had not told the board what happened. He had not made a single call of his own. He sat at the head of the table, calm, waiting, with the patience of a man who has all the leverage and no interest in using it as a weapon. "I'm sorry to keep everyone waiting," Preston said. His voice was not steady. "It's all right," Keanu said. And then he asked the question quietly to Preston, in front of the whole board, and it was not a trap. It was the only thing he actually wanted to know. "An hour ago, on your floor, you had no idea who I was. There was nothing in it for you. So that's the version of you I got to meet." He let it sit. "Is that how you talk to people when you think it doesn't cost you anything?" Preston Crane opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "Can I have 5 minutes?" Preston said. "Alone, please." They went down the hall to his office, which had been his father's office, the big desk Edward Crane had sat behind while telling his son he didn't have it. Keanu came in and looked around at it and sat down in the chair across from the desk. Preston did not sit behind the desk. He could not. Somehow, he sat in the other guest chair next to the man he had humiliated. "I had 3 calls lined up," Preston said. "Coming back down that hall, I was going to manage this." He shook his head. "There's nothing to manage. I know that now. I didn't come back to ruin you, Keanu said. If I wanted to walk, I'd have walked. I'm still here. And then it came out of Preston Crane, the thing he had never said out loud to anyone. His father. The contempt at the dinner table and on the floor. You'll run this into the ground. You don't have it. You never did. 11 years of trying to disprove a dead man. The debts, the fear, the prophecy getting louder every quarter. And the worst part? The part that made his voice break? That was him out there this morning. On the floor. That wasn't even me. I heard his voice come out of my mouth. I've turned into the thing I spent my whole life terrified of. He pressed his hand to his eyes. And I can't seem to stop. Keanu listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not rush to make it better. I've spent a lot of my life being underestimated, he said after a while. And I've lost more than I'll get into. And here's the only thing I know for sure about strength, after all of it. He leaned forward. The cruelest people I've ever met were the most afraid. Every single time. Your father wasn't strong, Preston. He was scared. Same as you. And he passed it down because that's what scared people do when nobody teaches them another way. He paused. Being kind when you've got all the power and nobody can make you. That's the only strength that was ever real. The rest is just fear in a good suit. Preston was very still. That welder, Keanu said. Tess, when you erased me in 4 seconds, you erased her too. She vouched for me, and you didn't even look at her. There were 20 people on that floor watching you decide what a person is worth. His voice stayed gentle. What do you think that taught them about working here? Preston closed his eyes. The script gives that a full breath. I'm not going to lecture you, Keanu said, standing. Your grandfather built this place one machine at a time, by people who put their names on the work. Your father ran it on fear, and it's dying. You get to pick which one of them you are. Go back out there and start with the woman whose weld you wouldn't even look at. Then he left the office to let Preston follow on his own. Preston Crane walked back into the boardroom, and then, instead of starting the meeting, he asked the board to wait, and he went down to the floor. He found Tess at her bench. The whole shop watched him come, the way they had watched that morning, braced for the next thing. He stopped in front of her, and he did not lower his voice this time either, but for the opposite reason. This morning I told you to get back to work, and I didn't look at you, he said, and the floor went quiet around it. You tried to tell me something true, and I treated you like you were nothing, in front of everybody. That was wrong. The man you were talking to said your weld was the best work he'd seen in years, and he's right. And I should have known it before a stranger had to tell me. He swallowed. I'm sorry, Tess. To you. And to all of you. My grandfather built this place on putting your names on the work. Somewhere I forgot that the names belonged to people. He turned then to where Keanu had come down to the floor behind him, and to Gus, and to the wall of 90 years of headstock stamps. I owe you an apology too, Mr. Reeves, he said. Not because of who you are. Because I'd have done it to anybody who walked in looking like they didn't belong. That's the part I have to fix. Keanu smiled. Not the careful one. The real one. Slow, crooked, unhurried. That's all I needed to see, he said. Because that, it turned out, was what he had actually come to evaluate. Not the books. Not the bikes. Whether the company had a soul worth saving, and whether the man at the top of it could still be reached. He had gotten his answer twice over, once on the floor that morning, and once just now. It was Gus who started the clapping 40 years of him, and it went up across the floor. Tess stood at her bench with her eyes wet, not bothering to hide it. Keanu shook Preston's hand, said something quiet that made the younger man laugh and look down, and then he drifted toward the door the way he'd come, letting the floor have its moment without him in the middle of it. It did not fix the $11 million. That is not how it works. The investment came through. Keanu's group led it. But money does not undo 2 decades of decline in a quarter, and Preston still had hard, frightening years ahead. There was a night that first winter when he sat alone in his father's office in the dark and felt the old voice come back. Felt himself about to snap at someone the next morning, and wondered if a man could really change at 44 or if he was just Edward Crane on a delay. It was Gus who told him the hard thing, the next day, over coffee at the bench. "You're gonna want to be him again," the old foreman said. "Pressure'll do it. The trick isn't never feeling it. The trick is what you do in the 10 seconds after you feel it. That's the only part you control." He shrugged. "Your grandpa felt it too. He just put it down. Your daddy never learned how. You can learn." So Preston learned, slowly, badly at first, then better. He moved his office down to the floor, a desk in the corner of the shop where his grandfather's had been, where he had to look people in the eye all day. He promoted Tess Okafor to lead fabricator and gave her a new hand-built flagship line to head, the first new crane model in 19 years. He restored Linus's original workbench and put it where the new hires could see it. And he did one thing nobody understood at the time. He had every machine that left the floor stamped not just with the crane headstock mark, but with the name of the person who built it, right there for the customer to see. The names belonged to people. It became the whole pitch. It became the thing that saved them. Tess did not quit in 3 weeks. 4 years later, her flagship machine was on the cover of 2 magazines, her name stamped on the headstock of every one, and she ran the floor Gus had run before he finally retired, to a party, with a cake, with his name on a plaque, thrown by a CEO who had learned what that was worth. And Preston, late one night that first year, found a box of his father's papers, and in it a letter Edward had written and never sent, to his own father, Linus, full of the same wound, the same "you never thought I had it," the same fear passed down one more generation back than Preston had known. He read it twice. Then he put it in a drawer, and he did not pass it down again. The chain stopped in that office. Keanu stayed a quiet partner. He never came to a board meeting. He came to the floor 2 or 3 times a year in his riding leathers, and went straight to whatever was half-built and most interesting, and talked to whoever was building it. He always checked in up front now. Preston had laughed about it, the first time. So had he. I've told a lot of stories on this channel. I keep coming back to this one. I think it's the question in it that stays with me. Who do you call when you've done something like that? Because the honest answer is nobody. There's no number you can dial that turns you back into a person you can live with. We spend so much of our lives believing the right phone call, the right move, the right spin will get us out of the things we do to each other. And it almost never will. The only way out of having been cruel is to walk back in and be something else. In person, with your own voice. I don't know that I'd have managed it. I'd like to think that if I'd heard my own worst parent come out of my mouth, I'd have had the nerve to stop and turn around. But honestly, I'm not sure. Most of us aren't sure. And maybe that's the thing worth carrying, that the cruelty we hand out is almost always fear we were handed first, and that, somewhere in the line, somebody has to be the one who stops passing it down. This story is fictional, inspired by Keanu Reeves's well-known reputation for treating working people with genuine respect. The company, the family, and the floor are invented. The voice that gets passed from one generation to the next. That part, I think a lot of us know. If this one reached you, drop a comment and tell me what you'd want to be remembered for when nobody's watching, and there's nothing in it for you. Share it with someone carrying a voice they didn't choose. If you want more stories like this, subscribe, and I'll keep telling them. See you in the next one.